The void has officially been breached, and after this video, I will be escaping into the new studio. But before I do that, I wanted to address a saying that has polluted the channel for well over, I don't know, like several years now. It's just been around and we've all heard it endlessly. The next Game of Thrones, a term that has come to mean, will this upcoming show be the next pop culture phenomenon to shatter records and carry a streaming service on its own into incredible success? But was Game of Thrones even the next Game of Thrones at one point? Yes, but it's way more complicated than that. And until this mentality goes away, this history of failures we've seen in the last few years is only going to repeat itself. That being said though, I truly do believe the next Game of Thrones is coming. I'm gonna prove it to you. Before we get into that though, next week we're dropping our Halloween merch line just in time for you all to be spoopied goblins who want to show off the fact that you're giant book nerds. So if you want to get this shirt or have it as a super nice sweater, just tune in to next week's fantasy news and you'll be first in line, which is important. Also, Man Carrying Thing released a video on this topic as I was writing this script, which made me go, are we making too similar of a video? But after watching it and talking to Jake, no, though he is making a part of this video for me easier to do. So I recommend you check out Jake's video when we're done with this to get a little bit better look into just why so much is failing for specifically epic fantasy. But fortunately, that complements my very goddamn point. One thing I want to dispel now that many of these streamers seem to have forgotten, and that is that yes, Game of Thrones did break many records, and it is most likely still considered the most successful epic streaming show of all time, and set bars that are still trying to be met today. But it's not the most successful show ever by almost any metric, and its viewership is absolutely dwarfed from an era of television where viewers were just less split. So if you really want to be a nitpicky asshole, Game of Thrones was trying to be the next MASH, and it never actually rose to those heights. That's redundant though, we're not going to exactly get into that, but I am going to use old school television to talk about the fact that we have seen these patterns of a success trying to be copied, and all of those failures overwhelming a market happen nearly identically before. And that was with Westerns. Just in the last 5 years, we have seen Rings of Power, Wheel of Time, House of the Dragon, Shadow and Bone, Witcher, Harry Potter again, Sandman, His Dark Material, which is actually, you should watch the His Dark Material show, it's pretty good. And so many others try and become, from their conception to broadcasting on tiny little screens, the next Game of Thrones. And this happened with Westerns to an even more egregious extent. In 1959 alone, there were 30 Westerns being broadcast on far fewer channels. And I would argue the only reason we haven't seen way more fantasy shows, even though we have seen a lot cranked out to try and copy that success, is that it's way more expensive to produce any type of valuable fantasy show than it is to crank out a Western back in the day. Putting a man in leather chaps and making him walk through swinging doors is dirt cheap compared to having costume designers prop all kinds of things, as well as getting the source material rights that are being protected more than ever. Can't be an original IP to get a fantasy show in front of an audience. Yet we are still seeing a deluge of them, which I think actually points out that, well, there's not as technically many by numbers. I think it's actually kind of closer than I might be implying here. The influx of fantasy adaptations is just as strong as the Westerns were back then. So many things trying to be the next Gunsmoke. But getting to the point made in Jake's video, I agree with him. Nearly all of these are doomed from conception because of this mentality we see in a quote you saw everywhere from Jeff Bezos when it came to why Amazon was developing the Rings of Power. From go, they wanted their next Game of Thrones. And he didn't mean that as in, I want to successfully adapt a fantasy show. It's clear he meant that as in, I want another pop culture phenomena, hence why they spent $1 billion on Rings of Power and a nearly equally egregious amount of money on their Wheel of Time adaptation. And I'm going to say something here that's going to be very contradictory to a lot of people who are angry when they heard Jeff Bezos say this back in the day. I think this is wrong of him to say for these franchises, not because they are too different, which is what everyone was saying back then, but because they are too similar. Hear me out. First of all, I don't believe that we are seeing a burnout of fantasy. An oversaturation, sure. And the distinction can even be seen in the top grossing films at movie box offices over the last couple of decades. Yes, there is an oversaturation of epic fantasy on television, but to then turn around and say that there is a fatigue happening for fantasy in general is ridiculous. I do not believe in genre fatigue. I believe in oversaturation and lazy attempts at cash grabs, which is why I feel the need to clarify I'm using the term next Game of Thrones as it's widely come to be understood. Fantasy or science fiction-based cultural phenomena, not just general cultural popular phenomena, because that's happened already. But in terms of us as sci-fi fantasy fans, there's a problem with the current attempts. And let's get into that. Or we're watching Marvel fail to meet the numbers it once had, the desire for a phenomena within the fantasy genre as a whole to become a smash hit at the box office or in the small screen is clearly still there. I mean, hell, there are other fantasy shows that have been near or over Game of Thrones numbers at times, including the likes of Stranger Things and Wednesday. And to Jake's point in his video as well, I think that conceptual problem of wanting to just make a hit rather than being driven by earnest desire to adapt material well is what led to a lot of the friction we saw on the Witcher set that resulted in the star who pushed for the show to get made leaving. And this gets to my true overall point and why the creativity for epic fantasy right now, despite it being at an all-time high for adaptation in terms of what we're actually being delivered, is at an all-time low. And that is because the mentality of recreating success is inherently regressive, and there is a stink to it. Whether it is the Star Wars sequels, Disney's live-action movies, a f***ing Gollum movie, which I love Lord of the Rings. Why? We can all smell that these are not artistic endeavors driven by passion. While there certainly could be passionate people involved, I have no faith that they're going to be able to fight back against the monolithic studio structures that be and able to win out bringing some true interpretation of this material when all those people who were funding them want is higher, bigger numbers. And we are in a time where AI is threatening to fucking overwhelm us with unoriginal, lazy art scraped from starving artists. Like trash left out in a kitchen, the smell is only getting worse. The box office and viewership downward trends aren't because people are suddenly breaking away from their screens or some generational bias complaint against some genre. It's because what is being beamed into our black mirrors isn't challenging or triggering emotional responses. Like, you know, when we got a fucking version of Black Mirror. For those of you who don't know, Black Mirror was a really interesting boundary-pushing show that, yes, was clearly inspired by The Twilight Zone, but was doing its own thing and actually trying to make its audience uncomfortable to the point where its original pilot episode was about a guy fucking a pig. But after it was sold over to Hollywood and ended up on just Netflix in the same hands of a lot of the people who've been trying to bring us these huge epic fantasy shows, is we got Miley Cyrus being mad at her dad episode, and then just a bunch of other even less original stories with like maybe an occasionally kind of good episode, but none of the highs from the original set of seasons. Bottom line, lazy executives want to be able to look at success, push a button, and copy success. And they seem still not able to comprehend that a lack of resources, a true origin from being just a fan trying to get something done, is what audiences respond to. Let's talk about the former point first. Resources. Because yes, the first season of Game of Thrones had a pretty big budget, and so have many other smash hit shows. But they had a big budget because the people behind them were passionate and fought hard to convince the moneymen that be to give them a chance. And so you see the likes of Fringe, Lost, so many others that had record-breaking budgets for their time for pilots or season ones. Yeah, be impressive. $60 million and the higher end estimate for season 1 of Game of Thrones is insane. But It's not going to solve every single one of your problems. In comparison, Season 1 of House of the Dragon had a budget of well over $200 million. Infamously, the first few seasons of Rings of Power are going to have a $1 billion budget, and Wheel of Time is in the same ballpark. I'm just going to make a comparison here. You know how often YouTubers or musicians who you enjoy end up getting successful, hiring editors, getting better equipment, and before too long, either the YouTuber kind of just looks like every other over-edited YouTuber and it gets a little obnoxious, something I try to actually avoid here on the channel, or the musician no longer has that like true heart connection you felt to their music, and instead they start sounding like the generic version of their genre that's everywhere else. It's because who is stepping in the room and the overabundance of resources preventing any challenges to enhance creativity. And so I agree with what many people, and even Jake in his video, have been saying. There's going to be essentially a bust within the fantasy, especially epic genre adaptation, as all of these huge flagship shows we've seen have begun to not have the returns that the studios behind them expected. There's going to be a massive extinction event. I think fairly obviously, no, I don't believe we're going to get every Wheel of Time book adapted. I don't think Witcher's going to continue on much further. Rings of Power seems like contractually obligated to keep going, but what that's going to result in, I have no idea. And even some shows that fans are fairly happy with, like Shadow and Bone, have just been axed, though you can attribute that to Netflix just being Netflix. But an extinction event leads to new growth. And I think that is going to be good for the fantasy genres and actually lead to us ironically getting, after we start searching for it, our next Game of Thrones. Because tying back to the example I used at the beginning, Westerns died out. They had their own extinction event. Yes, there were always some on TV here and there, but never near the peak of what was happening in like the 50s. But then after the extinction of the Western, the smaller bits and pieces continue on. Yes, there's never been no Westerns on TV, but like the mammals rising after the dinosaurs, life of the genre was allowed to change and evolve. And now, ending just last year, we had the undeniable, most successful, closest we've actually truly had by numbers to new Game of Thrones Western of all time. Yellowstone. A show that seems to have recaptured the magic of Westerns for the original audiences while evolving the concept with modern day innovation and making something that hits successes that many of those old Westerns could only dream of. If not, no, they couldn't even dream of the success Yellowstone has had. If you have a boomer parent, they're watching frickin' Yellowstone. So what truly will be the next Game of Thrones? Something that's fought for, something that has passionate fans behind it who have to convince a room of money men that there's potential here. Don't give us hundreds of millions of dollars, and instead give us an impressive budget, enough to realize a vision from visionaries who actually want to adapt something or even create, heretical to say, I know, an original IP, original concept for TV, and then it's given time to grow its audience. Season 1 is actually viewed less than Season 2. Season 3, you get a bigger and bigger budget. That is what I believe in, and I do not think it will be anything even in the ballpark same fantasy genre as Game of Thrones. Personally, as a betting man, with the way trends are going for readers right now, which occasionally is a precursor for the next big adaptation wave, it could be a lit RPG show. Look at that right there. Cutting off the inevitable comment of lit RPG is not real literature, so it couldn't be the next culture. What do you think people said about Game of Thrones and epic fantasy in general before it became the cultural phenomena it is? It takes something to be a flagship to then push us all to then realize, oh, there's value and merit there. It could even be something that's more fantasy minimalism, like Abercrombie. It could be a Murderbot adaptation that, in a time where everyone is so stressed out and closed into their doors and addicted to their phone, the relatability of Murderbot seizes us all by the heart and becomes a tremendous hit. All of those adaptations I'm talking about aren't having the label put on them yet of the next Game of Thrones, because you can't call it. That's the point. Tying in a point I forgot to at the beginning here, I do, to my core, believe that there's no general
fantasy or science fiction fatigue happening. The box offices and still many of the most popular shows on TV right now prove that. There could be a little bit of burnout for general epic fantasy, but the next Game of Thrones just needs to be able to breathe. The space is so crowded by people trying to ride the coattails of success that there could even be a potential next GOT that just hasn't been able to garner the viewership it deserves. I'm sure this comment section is going to be filled with some people naming some. And for that reason, for the next Game of Thrones to happen, there needs to be that extinction event. We need to let everything play itself out so that the next Yellowstone for our genres can happen.
This has just been my rambly thoughts on a problem that's been percolating around my brain ever since I first started seeing the next Game of Thrones on book covers and then saw it leap on over to TV. And in the meantime, let's stop saying everything is a failure just because it's not shattering those same records. Arcane is unbelievably important, in my opinion, to eventually allowing a wider audience here in America to be open to animation. I have shown it to over a dozen people who are not into animated shows who now devoured season 1 or looking forward to season 2. What's going to be the next Arcane to help broaden the animation audience? I want to have that conversation. The Cosmere, I believe, will do better as it finally is adapted, if it is in the near future. If it's not loaded with that baggage, I want to see the Mistborn adaptation, or whatever. Apparently Sanderson just hinted that maybe his one shot could get adapted. I want it to have a disappointingly small budget, and I want to see people behind it fight like hell. And that way, even if there's some weaker visuals, some scenes we couldn't appropriately recreate, what resulted in it finally being on my device is artists fighting like hell. That's my thoughts. Like and subscribe if you have not already. Hit the Patreon if you want to support what I do here. And have a good one, y'all. I'm moving into my house tomorrow, and I couldn't be more excited.